This podcast is presented by the Prince George's County Memorial Library System.
Hi, I'm Hannah.
I'm Kelsey.
And this is our podcast, These Books Made Me. Today, we're going to be talking about Alanna, the First Adventure, the first book in the Lioness series by Tamora Pierce. Friendly warning as always, this podcast contains spoilers. If you don't yet know the secret of the Black City, continue at your own risk, or you may lose your soul. We have two special guests this week. Could each of you introduce yourselves?
I'm Aya. I work in circulation at PGCMLS.
And I'm Lauren. I'm a youth services librarian at the Bowie Library. So I'll start us off. For those of you who don't know, because this is an audio medium, I am a bright redheaded girl. So this book featuring a bright redheaded protagonist was very special to me growing up because I saw a lot of myself in the protagonist. And I'd like to ask you all, what did this book mean to you?
So for me, I'm not a redhead, but I loved Alanna because she was so stubborn and angry all the time, which I suppose is kind of a redheaded stereotype. But I just really loved how she fought with basically everything she came into contact with and stuck to her guts and everything like that. So it was very meaningful to me growing up because most of the heroines that you meet when you're growing up are very well behaved, and Alanna is not always well behaved.
Well, I am not as bright of a redhead as Lauren. I'm a more faded ginger type, but I nevertheless found some representation in Alanna. And also, I was obsessed with horses and swordplay and fantasy fiction. And so this was a book that was very near and dear to me.
And I'm a noob. I've never read this book before. I have honestly never been much of a fantasy reader. Though I tend to enjoy it when I read it, I just not a place I gravitate towards. I do have very faded pink hair right now, so slight air of relatability there. But yeah, it was interesting. I have a lot of thoughts, and we'll get into them. Mm-hmm. But I could definitely see loving this book as a kid, and there's definitely a lot of merit in the mission of what I think Tamora Pierce was trying to convey through her work.
So for those in the audience who haven't read it, Alanna, the First Adventure, is about Alanna of Trebond. This is a little summary for you. Alanna has always wanted to be a knight, not a fancy lady learning how to sew in some convent. So when her father tries to send her away to become exactly that, she switches places with her twin brother and heads to Chorus to become a knight. While hiding her true identity, she deals with new friends, new enemies, and her growing magical abilities. But what happens when her best friend, Prince Jonathan, heads into the mysterious Black City and right into danger?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about who Tamora Pierce is. So Tamora Pierce, a notable Pennsylvanian, which is near and dear to me as a less notable former Pennsylvanian, and a Sagittarius. And this is true. You can check her bio. She reveals this. She credits first her father and then an English teacher for fostering and nurturing a love of writing and reading, particularly works of science fiction. She had a somewhat unsteady childhood. She moved from Pennsylvania to California and then back to Pennsylvania as a result of her parents' divorce. They lived on welfare and experienced the joys and the challenges of life in rural America. And Pierce ultimately finished high school living with her family in a one-room hotel. And during this time, she slowly emerged into her own as a self-described geek. She went on to study at University of Pennsylvania, where a professor encouraged her to write her first novel. She did not complete her psychology degree, as she failed statistics. And instead, according to her bio on her website, her degree just said Bachelor of Arts, which I didn't know you could just get a generic degree, but apparently she talked them into it. After college, she got a job as a house mother in a group home for teens, and she wrote another novel, which would ultimately become the Lioness series. Initially, however, she wrote this as a 732-page adult novel, and the director of the group home where she worked told her that it was inappropriate for the teens that she worked with. So instead, as Pierce describes in her biography, she retold the stories out loud for the teens, which ultimately proved helpful when her first agent suggested that she turned it into a quartet of books for this age group. Tamora Pierce seems like a truly delightful person, based on all the research I've done. I've referenced her website bio several times, and it's truly a joy, and I highly recommend reading it. I've just provided some excerpts here. She refers to her partner of 25 plus years as her spouse creature, and she proudly refers to her, quote, hillbilly heritage and her love of martial arts. She seems to base many of her characters off of her real life. She modeled Alanna after her younger sister Kimberly, and she modeled another character, Duke Rogers, on a high school boyfriend. After the success of Lioness, she went on to write many more fantasy novels, almost all of which focused on strong, gender-defying female role models.
Each episode, our luminous literarian and frequent co-host Hawa will provide miscellaneous insights from our book. It's time for Hawa's Headspace.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Hawa's Headspace, the part of the podcast where I literally say whatever comes to mind. For today's segment, I'll be in conversation with Hannah. Say hello to the people, Hannah.
Hello, people.
And I'll be guessing what Alanna and the first adventure is about based on a few covers. Before now, I haven't read any of the series or looked at any of the covers. Hannah's going to let me know how off base I am, and from there, read the synopsis. Okay, so I have a Google Doc here that Hannah put together with a couple different covers. The first one that I'm looking at is there's a horse on it. Like, there's a horse just like smack dab in the middle of the cover, and it looks like it's like in a picture frame. It feels very like old timey, not like country western, but maybe like wartime, like back when they used to fight with horses or something. The first adventure in the title makes me think maybe this might be a historical time, maybe?
So far with your reaction to that first cover, and I threw a lot of cover art at you, so sorry if it's too much, but you're pretty close to accurate. Like the only thing that like maybe that you said that maybe wasn't pretty spot on was the historical, because it's pseudo historical in some ways.
I'm looking at another cover. So I'm guessing Alanna, who I'm guessing is our heroine for this series, and she is on the cover with a horse. Okay, horses must be very important in this. Is that a sword? She has a sword.
She totally has a sword.
That's pretty cool. I wasn't expecting the sword. She looks like she might be like 12. Is she going off and fighting? Like, all right. So this one that I'm looking, oh yeah, she definitely has a sword. So on this one, there are two horses on the cover. Someone else is on a horse, and they look like they're in armor. And in the back, I see possibly castles. And like, it's funny because like the way she's holding the sword almost looks like it's one of the buildings. I think that's pretty cool. And she's looking up. She looks like she's like a very serious, I don't play no business, you don't want to see her with a sword type.
So far, you're saying no untruth. This is all like pretty.
Okay, I'm gonna scroll through a couple more.
Like.
It's interesting because in all these covers, she looks different. The second and third covers that have her depicted have her with like short hair, but like this next one has her with like really long hair and like reddish hair. Like she didn't have that hair in the other covers. But then back to this another one, she has short hair. Maybe, she may feel like she has to fight to save her city or not her city, but, her community. She's using swords, and horses are clearly an integral part about how she goes about this. And it being her first adventure, it also implies that there may be many more to come.
I mean, honestly, you pretty much got everything right. Like the cover art clearly did a pretty good job of conveying the like importance of horses and swords, because they're definitely huge. Alanna is in training to be a knight.
I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, so you were all around like the shape of her, horses, swords, knighthood.
Why did my mind draw a blank to that?
Now you mentioned her short hair because she is in disguise as a boy. Because
I was wondering that after the fact. I was like, this is given kind of like, I don't want to say like Mulan-ish, but it kind of felt
totally.
like that.
And the one that has her with very red hair.
Yeah.
Like they actually made her because she has purple eyes, believe it or not. So like they actually like portray her purple eyes, which I don't know why. It cracks me up that she has purple eyes for some reason.
Purple eyes.
Yeah.
I was not expecting the magical elements that are described in the synopsis. I don't know how like strong they are in the actual story, but that was something I wasn't expecting just from looking at any of the covers, to be honest. Maybe except for this last one that's on here that looks like it's showing like faces coming from like this cloud over the castles. Maybe that kind of felt like it had like a magical aspect to it.
You're right. I don't think they represent the magic well on these covers. And it is a pretty big theme in the books, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's hard to portray. I mean, you can do it, but like that's maybe harder to portray magic on a cover than horses and swords. But yeah.
Alrighty, well, that's it for this segment of How is Headspace, and make sure to tune in next time to see what else is going on in this brain of mine.
Alrighty, so let's go ahead and dive right into the discussion. Now, this book was originally published in 1983, but it didn't really sort of gain super popularity until the 90s. Now, this was quite a bit of time ago for all of you younger listeners out there. So I put this out to you all. How does this book hold up?
I think thinking like from a writing style perspective, I think this is true of a lot of children's books from this particular time. It's like they're afraid that kids can't handle like complex writing. So it's very like short, declarative, very informational, like similarly structured sentences in a way that like conveys very well what is happening, but isn't the most like artistic. Like it's very like direct and to the point. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that it necessarily didn't hold up, but it really stood out as like being a little like of that time when we were still figuring out like what books for kids look like and if we can make books for teens and that kind of stuff. So I feel like that kind of jumped out to me.
I would definitely agree. There's just this lack of style at times. It seems like Pierce is kind of writing as quickly as possible, as much plot as possible to capture the attention of her audience, but not using literary tricks or technique really at the same time. I was kind of shocked by how much I was judging the writing when I was reading it because I loved it so much growing up.
It's definitely a very straightforward book. Like I didn't really notice the writing style or I didn't criticize the writing style as a kid. As an adult, I'm kind of like, all right, this book is not a subtle book. It's there's a clarity and a straightforwardness to it, which, you know, is both good or bad. But yeah, like you said, it's very plotty. It's like, this is what happens to me. It kind of really feels like so many other fantasy fiction of the 80s. It kind of, I can't really define what that is, but it has that feel for me, but also, albeit, you know, aimed at a younger audience.
Yeah. I mean, I do want to say like, it definitely sucked me in right away.
Yes.
Like the fact that we immediately started and it was like, and we're off on the adventure. Like the reason I don't like to read a lot of fantasy is because I get impatient with all the details. Like I'm like, I get it. The world exists and it's different and there's people and they look different, they smell different and whatever. Like I want to like learn that as I go. And I feel like sometimes it takes too long to get there. So I appreciated that she was just like, I'm throwing you in and you're going to have to figure out how this world works as we go.
Yeah, I think it was like the first like 5 pages or less. The first major conflict comes in and she's putting forth this plan to go undercover as her brother, like instantaneously. Yeah. And I think it's also indicative of like the age group maybe she was writing for this book. Because when I was first reading it in middle school, I definitely didn't notice like a lack of subtlety. I just thought this is a really exciting plot. I'm really loving this. And it kind of started me on my journey of fantasy book reading. And as I've gotten older, the books have gotten more complex and more descriptive. And I mean, now you've got George R.R. Martin spending 10 pages describing all the different tenants of all the different houses and all the different world building. And as a child, that probably would have turned me off to a book. I would have gotten very bored, being like, I don't know these people yet. So the fact that it jumped right in and was very kind of like, here's the plot, was very appealing to me as a young reader.
I would really agree with that. I think if you're looking at other very influential fantasy works, Harry Potter comes to mind, and this predated Harry Potter by quite a bit. And I also read it, I think before I read Harry Potter, because my father was very into fantasy and he would go out and look for books with women in them and bring them back even if they weren't quite age appropriate for us. So I think I read it before, and it just deals with plot so much faster than George R.R. Martin or Harry Potter because it condenses her entire training as a knight into, I'm thinking it maybe takes 2 books and it's like maybe 400 pages. And you get that rapid fire plot and you can read it and it builds up your stamina for reading. I think it was very effective. And now I can do something like embark on a George R.R. Martin book and I've built up my tolerance for it. So I think there's something to be said for learning with some training wheels on.
Alanna was training to be a knight, and we were training to read really, really long books.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, also for how short it is, a lot happens in that first book, and it spans so many years.
Yes. Yeah.
So she really does like cram it in. And when I was first reading it, it didn't feel like a short book. It felt like this big fantasy book. But I think you said the audiobook itself is only like 5 hours long or something.
It was definitely a fast read. I think we also wanted to point out that another artifact of it being written in the 80s is a lot of cringe inducing verbiage, particularly the word pert. I don't like that word.
Pert was not a fun word to rediscover.
No. Not a fan. Not a fan to listen to in an audiobook. Just not great. Canoodling also comes in. So just a little bit of dated vocab.
There's also some class privilege. I was rereading it just yesterday, and there's kind of a throwaway line where we find out that there are slaves in chorus, and they're never mentioned again. So it's just they're this throwaway piece of world building that I don't think we would write so casually today.
I missed that entirely. I have to go back and... That's how quick the mention was.
Yeah, it's one word. Just when Alanna is walking through the marketplace, she sees all these new things, and one of them is slaves. So I don't know if chorus is a stop on the road or a market, but it really stood out to me on my reread that you would not build a world like that now without taking responsibility for it, or hopefully you wouldn't.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive into a little bit more to the character of Alanna. For me personally, she was very influential on who I was as a child. I was very tomboyish. I was into sports in a time when it still felt like you had to either choose one or the other, be into sports or be a girl, like a quote unquote girly girl. And so I saw a lot of myself in the character of Alanna.
Well, she's definitely, like you said, the kind of the archetype of the tomboy who's not comfortable with traditionally feminine roles, which I think speaks to many people then and maybe even now, although I don't know, going back to if it's held up, I don't know if it reads the same now as it does then, but I know it really spoke to me. I was also tomboyish. I was interested in esoteric sports like fencing, which I did as a kid, not at the time that I read this. But I mean, I think for anyone who's kind of felt uncomfortable with like a binary of being feminine, girly, or other, like Alanna, was kind of a bit of a role model for many of us.
I really appreciated that she seems to know herself really well, and she's unafraid to express exactly what she wants and tell people like, this is who I am and you're going to have to like accept that. One scene in particular where she's going through her first couple days of being a page, and she's like so tired. She can't catch up with her homework. She can't catch up with her housework, and they're just like keep piling stuff on. And she tells Coram like, yeah, I'm done. Like, we're going to leave. This is not working for me. And the argument that they have, I feel like, I don't even know like how exactly to describe it. But like when I was listening to it, like the way she was expressing herself felt very fresh to me in a way that I don't really often hear like female characters like express themselves so confidently and saying like, I know this is not right. I know this is not what I signed up for. And I know you're going to tell me that I'm quitting, but I know that this and this. And like, yes, she does end up changing her mind. But the fact that she doesn't like let it herself be like, she kind of comes around to it on her own terms. She doesn't let him say like, oh, just, figure it out. And I know there's like an interesting dynamic there too, with like him being her servant technically, but he also is kind of in a father role for her. And so for her to kind of speak to him like, I don't know, there was something about that really stood out to me, and I can't even fully explain it, but I just really appreciated her in that moment.
She was able to articulate a boundary, like sort of a breaking point very well, which you don't always see in especially female coded characters. They kind of like internalize, take it in until they have like sort of like some really bad thing happen like outside of those private conversations. But instead she just was like, this is what I'm feeling. This is not right. And I know this is not the way it's supposed to be.
Right.
Yeah. She recognized the thing that I think kids in general can identify with. Like, I think kids are big on noticing when something is fair or not. And she looked at the system, was like, this is designed to beat you down. You really can't win. She recognized and, had her strong and correct emotion about this is not fair. And then you see her kind of go, well, fine, it's not fair, but I'm going to do my best anyway.
Right. It's not fair, but I know that I need to do it in order to reach my ultimate goal. So like, I'm just going to do what I can to push back against the things that aren't fair, but accept what I can't change about it.
She also adds to her training in ways that might be considered from a chivalrous perspective, kind of cheating. She learns underhanded fighting from one of her lower class friends, and she practices, when other people aren't practicing. She doesn't stick to the curriculum. And I think that as much as children like to maybe resonate with the idea that Alanna sees when things aren't fair, I think they cheer her on when she's able to conquer these challenges partially by not following the rules, because isn't that kind of the dream when you're that age, that you might be able to overcome something doing it your way instead of the way of everyone wants you to do it, which I think she's able to do really well.
I think you see that, because I agree. I do think that you can look at some of the things she does as like underhanded or cheating, but she also it's almost like a training montage. You get like this sense of she puts in an incredible amount of hard work. So it's a little bit underhanded, but it also kind of speaks to her strength of character.
Well, yeah, cheating is a strong word. I think the world she's in is kind of broken. There's even a hint that maybe Pierce wants us to consider that, because one of the knights who teaches them is very against the code of chivalry and thinks that maybe it asks too much of the knights. And Alanna thinks about that during the book. So I think that maybe when I say cheating, I just mean she circumvents the system the way other people are using it. I don't think she's doing anything wrong. I think she's doing the right thing.
She's problem solving.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that ties in also, you mentioned she learns these underhanded tricks. She uses a lot of these sort of, not necessarily shortcuts, but she uses this creative thinking to get around obstacles that are unique to her. She learns the underhanded fighting because she is explicitly shorter and more slight and not as strong as the other pages in knight training. And if she wants to be on that same level, she has to get creative in her way of dealing with the situation.
She uses her perceived weaknesses to her advantage.
Absolutely.
She learns from her weaknesses instead of just accepting them, which I think is a very good role model for children that age.
Yeah.
She turns things that people tease you about into something she learns from, and it develops her character.
Just to bring this in, Tamora Pierce has tweeted before to suggest that, if this term existed at the time, Alanna might be gender fluid. And I think that's interesting because we can talk more about this idea of ascribing current terms to past folks who maybe don't accept them for them to claim that title for themselves. But I think it's interesting because to me, Alanna she's not living as a man because she wants to be a man. She's just doing it to get what she wants. But she also doesn't really seem to want to claim femininity either. She almost doesn't really seem to be interested in either. She just wants to be who she is. And but then the annoying thing is she rejects femininity rather than just saying that's not for me. She has to hate on it in a way that I think is really frustrating.
She has a lot of internalized misogyny for sure.
Yes.
Yeah. She could just simply say that's not for me, and other girls can want this and this, but I don't want to do that. The fact that she has to say ew, you called me a girl, or you think I'm girly like this, that's always frustrating to me, that it can't just be that's not for me. It always has to be being a woman is disgusting.
Yeah, she says to Coram at one point, I don't want to be soft and silly. And he kind of looks at her, he's you're only silly when you're talking like this.
Right.
Yeah. I think I was thinking about this question, the insertion of the word gender fluid into Alanna's character, and I reached the part of the book where she gets her period for the first time. And that was actually interesting because she says she wants to use her magic to get rid of it. And that was the first moment where I was oh, maybe there is something more complicated going on, because that's a deep feeling of unease in your own body.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of played off in the moment as being grossed out and not wanting to give in to something. But I think reading it now in 2021, it reads very differently. So I was kind of talked around to the possibility of Alanna being gender fluid by that moment.
Everyone defines terms differently, right? So it's so hard to say. I just think maybe gender fluid isn't it, but maybe she's trans, or maybe she's non-binary. I think the fact that she doesn't seem to want to embrace any aspect of her femininity, to me, seems like maybe she wouldn't be gender fluid, because that to me is someone who kind of switches back and forth or has different feelings on different days. And her feelings feel a little more concrete in wanting to move away from that. But she also is so bound up in all of the disadvantages that come from being a woman. Like she can't really escape the societal pressures of not being able to pursue the life she wants to live and having to hide those aspects of herself. Like maybe she would feel differently if those boundaries weren't there, if she could like explore that a little bit more.
You saying that it's not that she wants to be a man or that she's just like wanting to go from one to the other kind of really resonated with me just now. And it's almost like in her mind, she views them as, I don't want to be a man. I don't want to be a woman. I want to be the magical third gender, a knight. Like she just wants to be, which I think could be so interesting. Like it's not about the gender. It's about like, this is what I want to do with my life. You know, my bodily functions have nothing to do with it. So it almost reads to me now looking back as non-binary, just kind of not wanting to go one way or the other. But I don't think it stays that way because a big part of Alanna's journey through this is almost magically forcing her to accept that she is female and her femininity. I mean, her getting her period for the first time and having to live with that is sort of our first indication that this is something she's going to have to learn to accept.
I honestly can't sort out in my mind what is Alanna's internalized misogyny, what is her figuring out her identity. I don't know if, at least for me, I don't get clarity about who Alanna is, but I do know that when she gets her period and she doesn't know what it is and she goes and talks to George's mother, like George's mother is very clearly like, nope, this is how it is. You're a woman. You can't change that. Like basically suck it up, you know, kind of in a kinder way. But like the narrative is definitely sort of enforcing the gender binary there, whatever Alanna's identity is kind of the message I got from that.
It's not much kinder than you're a woman, suck it up, in my opinion. Yeah. I didn't think that was a very gentle scene at all. I thought that George's mother was kind of forcing her into a box that she didn't want to be in. And I think that maybe writing in the 80s and the early 90s, this was interesting and revolutionary as it could be to have this feeling of dislike for your femininity and to be able to exercise power over it. But I think that it does read as really dated now.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I will say that was, since I was reading it when I was at that age, it was my first experience reading about a period in a book ever. And I think for me, that was revolutionary. She even says, Tamora Pierce says in one of her interviews, like all of the books she was reading, nobody goes to the bathroom, nobody like sweats ugly. And she wanted to explicitly be more realistic. And that was something I picked up on when I was reading it. And it grounded it more for me because it was something I was going through at the same time. And so that added an extra layer of connecting to this character.
And it's still like not really a common thing to see in books. Like I can't think of many other examples, although spoiler alert, this season we will be reading at least 2 books that have it in it and one that talks about puberty in other ways. So I guess the ones that do really leave an impact. But it really is like menstruation is really a topic that books really shy away from, which is such a shame because at least 50% of people experience it and they should be able to read about what that experience is and all the different ways that experience can be perceived, whether you're excited about it, whether it causes dysphoria, whether you hate it, whether you're afraid. Like we need that representation and we really don't have it.
Maybe Alanna's on the extreme of not knowing at all what it is, but I think that there's like a spectrum of people being surprised by periods when they encounter them, and I think it can be really upsetting and traumatic.
I think it's interesting that Alanna, within her realm of reference, is going to look at a period kind of as a wound, because that's how she thinks about blood. That's how most of us think about blood, but Alanna is trained to be a knight. I think that puts some interesting context on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's like a damage that happens to her when she first perceives it. And that's partially because of the lack of cultural context she has about being a woman and the lack of female figures in her life.
I think it's also affirming to read about a character who, when she first gets it, it is so traumatic and startling to her that she utterly rejects it. Because I feel like that is probably a little bit more common than we see portrayed in media and in books. Because usually it's like, oh, your mother or female figure takes you aside. This is what's happening to your body. But she is like taken aback and she is like, I don't want this. This is not in my plan for my life. Like this is going to do nothing but detract from my goals that I'm working hard for. And I think it was important to see that because not everybody's first menstruation experience is the same, and it kind of rounds out that representation some.
I definitely was like, I have to do this forever.
Yeah,
like
every month for the rest of my life.
She's overwhelmed by the logistics, and that's like so relatable.
Yeah, this is a scheduling conflict.
Really
Can we
is.
not?
You're like, can we just skip a month? And I mean, like they gloss over. They don't talk about Alanna experiencing like a lot of pain or discomfort, but like that's what comes with menstruation a lot of the time. Although people's experiences are different, it's relatable that she would be like, oh heck no.
Yeah, because she's already facing all of these insurmountable odds, trying to train to be a knight, not only being smaller than all of the other boys, but keeping her identity a secret from everybody. And now she's got once a month where she has to, on top of all of these other things, has to hide the fact that she's got additional blood that nobody else has leaking out of their body. It's definitely a challenge.
I think also like that whole conversation with George's mother was interesting too, because we talked about this a little bit while we were preparing, but I think for the time, a very progressive like conversation around sex, right? Because she gives her like a method of birth control and actually talks to her about like this could happen, right?
Magical birth control.
Right. But doesn't talk about, I forget who mentioned this when we were preparing, but like doesn't really talk about anything else, like how to, make sure that it's a positive experience.
Talks about consent or like what the boundaries and how to go about like negotiating these things are. She doesn't really touch on any of that.
This was something that bothered me, and I think I was one of the people who brought it up. She mentions that Alanna might want to have sex, and Alana's like, I'm never going to have babies. And she's basically just like, well, women like it too, which I think for the time was revolutionary. I mean, you're educating someone in female pleasure. But on the other hand, you're not really educating her. The lack of sex ed is kind of startling, that you would just give someone birth control and send them out into the world with no real education. And I think it is suggested that the knights get some kind of education, so she knows the male part of it. But that's not exactly a great alternative.
Not equivocal.
No.
One-sided.
So I felt very let down by this character, George's mother, who otherwise I rather like.
Yeah.
There definitely is some world building put throughout it. We get introduced to some Middle Eastern type characters towards the end of the book. What are your all's thoughts on the inclusion of this people?
It's very Lawrence of Arabia stereotype, the noble desert people, which is not the worst it could be. I want to be very clear, but it's also not the best use of diversity.
An attempt was made.
Yes, she tried. I think she had good intentions. She didn't
stick the landing.
She did not. It was definitely heavily stereotyped, exoticized portrayals of what are clearly meant to be Middle Eastern people.
Yeah, they were very superstitious. They were very like beholden to their sort of old ways. They didn't want to submit under the quote unquote colonial rule of the king and the monarchy.
I think too, like the fact that they're the only like people with any cultural or racial difference in the whole book makes it stand out worse. Like if it had been like a generally diverse book and this was also part of it, it'd be like, okay, that's one kind of person, there's another kind of person. But because they're like the only quote unquote different people, it's like it really stands out in like how clunky it is.
She doesn't set herself up for success because she limits her diversity to tokenism. And when you have a token, it's never going to work. So I think that's really unfortunate. I will say that Tortall, as it developed, into the 90s and the 2010s and even into now, does get more diverse. I just want to throw that out there. But this book does not do a good job.
And that's something I really respect about Tamora Pierce. Like she seems very committed to like learning and growing as a writer. This was her first ever book. So like she definitely like, it seems to me, recognized that was a flaw and worked on it. And we have a quote from her is this from her Twitter?
It was from this 2018 interview.
Okay.
Is where I found it.
Yeah. So she says, as times have changed, I've tried to bring more variety in my characters to my books. It's important that readers feel part of my universes. There's too much exclusion and battering in this one. And I'm not perfect at it. Sometimes I screw up royally in my attempts to portray people of different races and beliefs. And sometimes I offend royally. Then I have to shut up, listen, learn, and try to do better. It's a process, but it's worth it. And I think that's exactly the right attitude to have.
I agree. I feel like authors will try to justify if they do a sort of unintended offense in a portrayal. It's like, well, I was going for this, or I meant it to be taken this way. You took it the wrong way. You didn't take it the way I intended. And the fact that she says like, I shut my mouth, I listen, I absorb, and like, I can't change it. So I just try to do better next time. I really appreciate.
I do too. I
I can think of a handful of writers who I'm not going to name who have not learned and not improved and have gone, well, you're just wrong. Like you were saying, like you interpreted it the wrong way. And she does seem to learn and work to improve as she goes on. And I haven't read a lot of her later books. I think some of you, I think Lauren and I have both read her more recent works, and it sounds like they've done some really interesting things in them. And my experience is more with her earlier works, like the Alanna books and the Wild Magic books. But it does sound like she has made strides in her later writings that she didn't have in her earlier.
I think even the difference between the Alanna books and the Wild Magic books, there's a stark difference in her representation of diversity. Yeah, I think she learned, what I hope is that she got some feedback on the Alanna books and took it to heart, and it sounds like she did.
Yeah, and I do love this idea that, like, as a fantasy writer, she feels that her job is to make a world that has more inclusion and less battering, which I love the idea of. There's too much batter. Like, I just love that as a word. She's very good with words. But I really admire that that's kind of her mission statement, it sounds like, is to make a better world through her book.
Absolutely. That being said, there is definitely a lot of classism in these books, especially in some of the relationships. For example, Alanna and Coram, her sort of pseudo-father figure / technically also her servant, and also the romanticization of Prince Jonathan throughout it. She kind of holds him up in this ideal, like, oh, he's going to be the next generation. He wants to get to know his people so he can be a good king, when it is still a monarchical system. I'm not sure if monarchical is a word, but I've just said it. So
yeah, Alanna is definitely part of the power structure of the kingdom. She's a privileged noble, and she does not examine her privilege very much. She just kind of goes with it. She wants to be a knight. Knights uphold the power structure. She's not a revolutionary in all ways. She's kind of conservative when it comes to her class outlook.
Yeah, I mean, and to speak about Jonathan, you know, he is kind of held up as this example of like a fair ruler, right? Like, he always does the right thing and he enacts justice and he protects her from Roland.
Oh, we want to talk about the naming convention.
Yeah. Okay. Quick sidebar. When I was listening to the audiobook, I can't see the names, and they say Alanna and they say Roland.
Rowland.
Alanna. Oh, Alan and Rowland. That's
Rhymes
it.
with Talon.
Alan and Rowland. And I'm like, they just put an R on Alan for her villain.
You know, the old villain trope. Just add another letter to the beginning of the protagonist's name and you've got your magical villain.
I mean, no wonder they hate each other. Yeah. Their names are the same.
Yeah, they're probably getting called each other's name all the time.
If you're reading it, it looks more different. You don't make that comparison. But if you're not looking at it,
it actually doesn't look that
creative.
much different. It is just Alan with an R at the beginning.
And an O. There's an O, isn't there?
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
So it's spelled like Talon.
So anyway, Rowland is he's kind of bullying Alan or Alanna, and Jonathan steps in and helps recreate the balance there and make sure that that's not happening, which is great. And I really like Jonathan. However, it doesn't really acknowledge the fact that, like, if he had been a jerk, like, he would still be the prince and there's nothing anyone can do about it. And it would be an unjust world. And so the amount of power that he has, and his father, isn't his father the Duke who's terrible?
His uncle.
His uncle. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, like, there are people with more power who are not great. You know, that whole structure is not really examined in kind of its flaws.
And Jonathan loves his uncle, who is not that great. So Jonathan is not awake to the world either. He is fully just in line for the throne. He's going to have that life. He's going to be a noble king, but a king is still a king.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And you see Jonathan be human and make poor decisions, and you see him do reckless things, and you're like, well, should this young man be in charge of a whole country? I don't know.
And I think that Alanna definitely misuses her relationship with Coram at times. Like, she's going to threaten him with enchantments and stuff like that if he doesn't keep her secrets. And it's not a very great introduction to her character for something that happens so early on in the book. And I think that always, not always, but that will always now stand out to me.
That was weird too, because she says, if he doesn't go along with it, I'm just threaten him with magic. And then she, like, sort of does, but, like, he doesn't have a very strong reaction. Like, he kind of seems like he was already on board anyway. And then when she uses magic in the future, it's like very showing, not telling, of like, oh, he saw she was doing magic and he thought that he would not be part of it. Like
he grimaces or he makes an evil eye.
It's not very the reaction is not as strong as she initially kind of made it out to be.
Yeah, that might be a side effect of the style of the writing as much as anything. I think that plot gets thrown away because Coram believes in her, and maybe she doesn't understand how much he believes in her and how he thinks of her as a surrogate daughter, because she has really no father. Her father is completely absent and her mother died in childbirth. I don't think she understands the deep nature of her relationship with Coram until she's much older.
And it's heavily implied that part of how she convinces him to not reveal the twin swap secret is she like fills the water skin or flask with brandy,
which he didn't notice.
He like takes a drink and spits it out all over the road, and then she talks him into it. It doesn't really make sense.
Really
and then she
doesn't.
treats his hangover. I think that Alanna might leave that thinking, I tricked Coram, but like really Coram went along with it because he's a little bit smarter than she thinks.
Maybe that's interesting. So maybe it was like partially intentional to kind of acknowledge that she's
A
10
child.
at that point. Like she's not as sneaky as she thinks she is.
I might stick with this reading because I like it more. It makes me like the characters more.
Yeah.
I also like how in the book it's essentially said that he ultimately agrees because when his horse like shies up, she like dodges right in and she like reins it down.
Yeah.
And he looks and he was like, your brother would have never been able
Your
to do that.
bratty brother.
Yeah, your brother was too cowardly and too wimpy to ever have been able to do that, and he wouldn't have survived as a knight. So
We need justice for her brother.
Justice for Tom.
yeah, justice for Tom.
Because he seems like a very nice young man, and I feel bad that he's slandered throughout this whole book.
If you want to read the later books and talk to us about them, we will. I think Hannah and I and Lauren will all be here for that.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and there's also, you do see a little bit of the parallelism between them because when Alanna starts to get very serious about her sword training, she explicitly stays up late at night and trains with the heavier sword when nobody else sees. And I think one correspondence she has with Tom is he's also doing something similar. He's playing dumb in his classes, but then late at night he's staying up and he's studying magic on his own. So there's definitely a lot of parallelism between the two of them.
Yeah, I loved that. Like as a twin, I've always been very sad that Alanna and Tom get separated and don't see each other for like 8 years.
I do want to bring up, though, that this, like, the whole plot doesn't actually work if you think about it.
Absolutely. It works for middle schoolers, okay?
The twin swap. So, like, okay, so Alanna gets away with it because when the Duke writes a letter to her dad saying, like, your son Alan is doing really great, her dad just responds and says, like, yes, I knew Tom would be great. And Alanna can just say, oh, my dad doesn't really pay attention to me, doesn't notice, whatever. When Tom is at the convent and they say, like, oh, your son is doing really good in priest training, and his father is expecting a letter about how his daughter's doing really well as a nun, like, I feel like that's going to stand out and be really difficult to explain.
That is a big plot hole that never gets addressed. I don't know if I would love Tom's perspective and like his shenanigans running around stopping letters from being sent. But the book just relies on this, like, twins can switch places. It's magic.
Yep. A lot of out of sight, out of mind for the convent storyline. Like, this is all about Alanna and her journey while she's training for knighthood. Tom made it there safely.
This is a world with magic in it, and Tom is, like Alanna's supposed to be very powerful. It doesn't seem that implausible that he could have, like, I don't know, enchanted their father's attention from a distance. I mean,
or even intercepted the letters, because he's always been portrayed as the intelligent one, like the whip smart one.
Yeah.
I could see him coming up with some sort of scheme, but
But
we
I
don't
wanna know
get to
what it
see him.
was.
Yeah, we don't get to see it, unfortunately.
All of that's very interesting, but none of it actually happens in the book.
Yeah. And if it happened, that'd be the first thing he'd write in the letter. Like, did you get a letter too? Because I had to run all around this town and like intercept magical letters. Like, that didn't happen.
That could be a great energy to read
Great
about.
fan fiction.
Yeah.
But with how much she already stuffed into that one book, I think following Tom too closely on his storyline would have dragged some things out a little more. But a line would not have gone unappreciated.
Yeah.
The fact that Alanna rejects magic and that an old wise woman is teaching her magic, and that her magic is connected to this secret she's keeping, but then she's also perhaps touched by the gods. Like, there's a lot of magic, and it does get kind of mixed up and confusing sometimes, or at least it did for me. But she's rejecting magic because she thinks it's cheating, and she's rejecting being a woman because she thinks people will think she's silly. They're both things that are obstacles to her, and that is it's an interesting dynamic that you don't normally see in a fantasy novel, where normally you're embracing magic and it's how the world building is stimulated.
I agree. This is the one place where I wanted more world building around, like, how does this magic actually work? I didn't really understand, like, who gets it and to what end can it be used? Like, what are the limits? Like, you get pieces along the way, but for me, as like not someone who is like listening to every single word, like, I didn't really feel like I got the full picture. And interestingly, so we were talking about this idea of like magic being female coded before I really finished reading. But as I went on, I didn't really pick that up in the same way. Like, I think that's a very common trope. But in this book, most of the people you see doing magic are men.
Yeah,
right?
I think there's a separation between healing magic, which is like women's magic.
But the healer who's in Jonathan's room is a man, isn't it?
That's true. There's Duke Baird, who is a male healer. But I think Tom in the beginning is very dismissive of Maud's magic. And I think that might kind of be where I'm picking up that thread, that Maud is like not a sorcerer, and that the priests train, or the nuns train girls in magic. He says something like, they always train girls in magic. It might be that they only train noble girls in magic.
Right.
So I think the world building is not explicitly clear, which I think speaks kind of to how the magic works. Like, I agree, it's not really clear what the rules of the magic are. But I think that Alanna, the combination of the magic and the femininity works from Alanna's perspective.
And I think the reason I picked up on it is, you're right, I don't think the world itself codes it as feminine, but Alanna having healing magic specifically, I think Tamora Pierce used the magic as sort of a plot equivalency to like, a big point is forcing her to accept her magic. And ultimately, her magic is tied to her femininity. So it's like the plot device used to make her have these character developments. Because at one point, she literally, if she doesn't use her magic, Prince Jonathan will die.
Yeah.
But she's always been like, so, just like getting her period, just so rejective of her magic.
Her magic reveals her gender too when she goes into this fun magical event. I don't want to give away spoilers, but her magic reveals her gender to Sir Miles, and then that's a kind of a tiny plot in the book. But when she is being very magical, she's a woman, not a girl. And when Jonathan's being very magical, he's a man, not a boy. So maybe it's more that magic is revealing people's true identities, and hers is, in the book at that time, a woman.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that she's ashamed of. And I think part of it is that it's not something that knights do, right? So like, even if it's something that men in the world do, it's not the kind of men that she wants to emulate. And again, similar to like her fighting underhand and those other things, she views it as cheating.
We saw that there was a shift mid-book, I think, where I think it was Duke Gareth who kind of says, I think after the sweating sickness, he's like, oh, knights need to learn every weapon in their arsenal, and they more explicitly decide to add magic training to the curriculum. So there is, like, you see that change, and how long will that change last? We don't know, but you do see at least one character kind of accept magic into the world of knighthood. And kind of going back to the, is magic coded feminine or otherwise? Like, I think it's a complex discussion, and I'm kind of mulling on all of your thoughts. When we first started talking off pod about this, I kind of saw it as, like cooking is kind of thought of as in our world of something that women do, but chefs are men. Like it just seems like I saw some parallels to how magic is treated in the Tortallverse.
I think that's a really good analogy. I think the women know a certain kind of magic, and then the men know a different kind of magic.
Magic in the home, healing magic, sort of smaller, and then you have the grand sorcerers.
Having visions in the fireplace versus healing the prince. I think also once Alanna, since she is our narrator, she is the lens in which we are seeing this story. Once she finds out Prince Jonathan also has magic, I noticed a shift after that in her sort of opening her mind to magic. Why should you cut off your arm to spite your or whatever that saying is.
I think she even talks to George about this. She's secretly practicing spells she's not supposed to, and she's ashamed of herself. And he says, like, no, you're just learning another skill and you're going to need it to defend your country. So you should learn it. And I think that is a major shift. And I wonder if her rejection of her gift is kind of motivated by her mother's death, the way her father's rejection of magic is motivated by her mother's death. And she just needs to see it in a new context of it saving people's lives instead of failing to do so.
They describe her eyes as violet in the books, right?
Or amethyst.
Amethyst, I'm sorry. It's very jewel-toned. All the important characters get jewel-toned eyes. And I know that's something that is a little tropey in fantasy books.
Hannah, what did you call it?
Technicolor eyes.
Technicolor eyes.
Because I think I used the phrase technicolor when we were talking about these books initially, because like the world seems very bright. And like you said, Aya, everybody has so much eye color, but it's also a description of the clothing. I'm imagining like Princess Bride, Errol Flynn, original series Star Trek levels of like bright primary colors, and that extends to the eyes.
Well, and I feel like it's also very common to see, like, especially in media where magic is involved, your eye color corresponding to either the type of magic you do or like the amount of power. Your eyes will flash sometimes when you do a certain thing.
Eyes are just they're very useful for signaling plot and emotion and importance, I think. I think that the characters who get their eye color called out a lot tend to be important characters, whereas I couldn't tell you I couldn't tell you the eye color of most of the people I work with. So I think that there's something very fantasy about that, the idea that you meet someone and you just notice their eye color immediately.
So they're the main character.
So there you go.
And the idea that somehow eye color says something about the person, like their character and skills and role in the story, like rather than just that's the eye color they happen to have.
Yeah, like Alanna has special eyes because she's special.
Exactly.
And Jonathan has sapphire eyes because he's noble and important. But like someone who has cold eyes is probably going to be a villain.
Right.
Yeah. If only the world were that obvious.
Yeah, I feel really bad for anyone who doesn't have blue eyes because you're not getting represented positively in this book.
Yeah. Speaking of representation.
Yeah. Luckily, I do, so I'm good.
So you're good.
There you go. I do not. Not a lot of green eyes in this one.
No, I guess there aren't green eyes. I kind of would expect it. This seems like the sort of book that would like a big deal about green eyes.
Like
but it's
emerald
pretty much,
eyes.
Especially for a red-haired person.
Well, she's special. She's got to be violet. Amethyst.
She's your classic Mary Sue.
There's something appealing about a Mary Sue sometimes.
Because you got to be able to see yourself in your media. And I mean, guys don't have flaws in a lot of the male-led like action whatevers. So let's get rid of some of our flaws.
That's a really good point. She's basically a superhero, and that's fine.
And I think it does get more nuanced the more books Tamora Pierce writes. Like, she definitely adds more character flaws to her people. So I'm a little bit more inclined to give her a pass for her first foray into expanding this genre.
Well, it's interesting when you think about it as what used to be the first quarter of an 800-page book. Like,
that's true.
It makes you wonder how much really changed, or if she really just kind of like cut stuff up and made book endings.
When I first saw in the bio that it was originally all 4 books were one giant book, my mind was like boggled because this takes her from like age 10 well into adulthood. And I just, that much traveling through your life in one book seems like a lot to me. So I'm glad she broke it down into 4 books.
I would read that book.
I would also read that book.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I would have read it.
I would have read the adult version anyway, because I want to know what all the like juicy bits that she had to cut were.
I would like to read that. That would be
One of
interesting.
the things I really like about her books is as she makes all these different series in the same world, you get cameos from all of these other characters that you love. And so it's kind of like like Alanna shows up in other characters' books.
That's
and it's,
cool.
As someone who loves the world, it's always very fun to be like, oh, there's, so-and-so. Oh, I want more. Like, what has their life been like?
Well, the Alanna cameo we get in some of the other books, like that Alanna, like the adult Alanna is almost unrecognizable when you like think of Alanna in these books. That's kind of a silly thing to say because she's a kid in this and obviously people grow and change, but she changed so much. Like the Alanna we see in this is like barely recognizable as the adult Alanna, which I kind of would have liked to see some of the narrative that got her to that point. Like how did she become the adult that she eventually becomes?
Now let's talk to someone who actually knows something about one of the main topics covered in this book. As a special treat this week, we have 2 guests.
Okay, so Kirsty, I just wanted to introduce you. So Kirsty Francis is a writer, editor, and queer medieval magic scholar, according to her website, and she studies at UCLA. Is there anything you want to add?
I think that covers it all. I'm a PhD candidate at UCLA. I work on magic and gender, and I'm graduating either in June or we'll see, depending on the job market.
All right, I kind of know a little bit of this answer already. I'm going to ask, what's your relationship to the book we read, Alanna, The First Adventure?
Yeah, it was given to me when I was 10 years old from my godmother when I was homesick with strep throat from like a used bookstore. I devoured it. Like, I just remember being so miserable, and it was such a great distraction. And then it took me a while to encounter the sequels. It was like 3 or 4 years probably until I went to the middle school library maybe and saw them on the bookshelf, or like the, and, I was already hooked from the first book.
What has changed as you've gone into this path of becoming a medieval scholar, like looking back on the work? Has anything changed with your relationship with the book?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that grad school does is it makes you ruin some of your favorite books and memories of your childhood. Not that this book is ruined for me. I think it really does hold up. But I think that coming back to it now as a not 10-year-old, I can see a lot of things, especially like in the larger series, that were more problematic. And I think the author's done a good job in recent work to correct. But I'm thinking here, like a major facet of the culture of Tortall, the city of, or the land of the book, is Bazir tribesmen. And the third book kind of engages in it engages in a lot of Orientalist tropes about, what it is to be Middle Eastern that are really cringy to come back to. Every single time the Bazir are mentioned, they're like the hook-nosed Bazir. And I just noticed myself like flagging as I reread this book, these descriptions that in 21st century, when you read the book, you're like, oh, wow, there are some things here that could be updated and need to be a bit more inclusive. But I also think that what's really cool about this book that I noticed coming back to it as a grad student too, is how radical it is in some ways from when it was published, right? It's published in the 80s, and the world that it portrays is a pretty radical one where, women are certainly like have a gendered sphere, but Alanna represents possibilities for women, and women have a couple of different possibilities that aren't even available to women in our world.
Yeah, Alanna herself is quite radical and liberating in a lot of ways. So it's interesting how that can balance, how you can have something very upsetting and tropes that we find very uncomfortable now, but at the same time, the book can be very liberating and freeing. Yeah, It's complicated. Just going right into your wheelhouse, what do you think about gender and magic in Tortall?
I love it. I have never encountered a magic system quite like the gift in that system and all of the YA and all the fantasy I've read, which is extensive. And I think that it's really creative the way that the gift, it kind of stays unexplained throughout the series. And that's something that, the magic in the series there's not a lot of attempts to figure out like, well, where does it come from, right? There's a lot that's left a mystery. Thinking too about like the old ones in this book. When she gets lightning her sword, right? Like there's a lot of history and magical background to Alanna that we're just kind of meant to trust. We're meant to kind of understand. And coming from this as a historian of gender and magic, I feel like this is kind of how it would be for a lay person in the Middle Ages. Don't get me wrong. In my work, I talk a lot about how natural philosophers like Roger Bacon and other big philosophy names of the time, like Thomas Aquinas, how they theorized and thought through of magic. Like they really were rigorous in trying to trace its origins. But the average person on the street would probably not be engaged in these university debates, right? And so I think what's really cool about this book is that the way that it makes magic so omnipresent and comfortable, and yet still showing the tensions that emerge from like folks who don't have magic, who can really see it as a danger and a threat, even as it is so integral to their world.
Yeah, I think that's really cool because you do touch on something we talked about, which is the fact that some people are very scared of magic in Tortall and the world. And that's something that you don't see a lot of in YA and fantasy. We also talked a little bit about the system of education in magic and how Alanna kind of learns from like a wise woman. And we thought that was pretty radical and cool. But that magic is also something that you learn at a convent or from these priest brothers. Is there anything interesting there from a historical perspective? Is Pierce drawing on anything?
I think Pierce is drawing on a couple of different things. One, the association, of course, with like magic and witches, right? That sort of feminine magic being in the space of the feminine. I think what's really intriguing in the way that Pierce frames it really mirrors a lot of medieval scholar or medieval understandings of magic, in that like perhaps popular or folk magic that would be done by a wise woman that would be very gendered female. But as soon as you get to the upper echelons of magic, right, like what Tom wants to do, he wants to learn to be a sorcerer. That's pretty much male only, right? You have to become a male Mithrin priest to go into the convent. And that really reflects, like, in the Middle Ages, a lot of the people who practiced magic were in fact the monks and the priests who also condemned magic, right? There's this really weird thing that, like, the top levels of the church are saying magic is bad. And yet, if you're looking at who's learning magic and who's like passing it around, this medieval magical theorist, not magician, Richard Kiefer, calls it a clerical underworld of magic that happens in the Middle Ages. And I think that that idea really fits in nicely to how Pierce displays magic or depicts it.
The other thing I wondered about when I saw where your studies had taken you was if you had run across any other lady knight tropes in your work.
That's great. And this is what I think keeps me so, I mean, not the lady knight trope, but like the way that Alanna grapples with magic and gender and what we think of as stereotypically male acts, right? Like being a knight. This would be something that was super gendered in the Middle Ages too. And you really rarely get an example of fighting women. And when you do, they're really idiosyncratic, you know, just like Alanna is in this first book. But they really stand out. And often I think what's very interesting is that like these women have some sort of supernatural or some sort of otherworldly connection that makes it okay for them to do the non-feminine activities they do. So I think that that's really interesting. When I think about this book, like I tend to kind of want to argue that magic is queer in this book, or magic serves a queering function, right? Like the moment that Alanna seizes her magical sword is like a really transformative moment for her in terms of like kind of personal identity and power. And thinking about like how these books both depict a world where magic kind of is integrated into the everyday, and yet there's still beliefs, right? Like the knights who argue you should never use magic because it's cheating. This weird tension around like, what does it mean to have like an extra power? I think mirrors really well like this idea of like, what does it mean to, like, what if you're born with queerness and you can't really understand it or explain it, but it just is.
It's beautiful. Oh, I love that. Well, it's really great. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Corwin Duncan, serial number 5426. Rank Ensign 5426 is just my guest number on here.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background in fencing? Like you're a former national champion, I believe.
A 3-time national champion, actually, but not that anyone's counting. I also, as I got into my late teens, I started coaching fencing and did that for probably 10 years or so before I transitioned out of being a coach. And I've also spent time as a referee.
So you took the time to read this whole book for the interview, which was awesome. Thank you. We're going to start with how accurate or not was the sword stuff in it.
In terms of sword fighting, I got to say there's not a ton of sword fighting in this book, right? It's mostly about this young woman and her, you know, her difficulties in pretending to be a boy and learning magic and all of this stuff at the same time. And for a period of the book, really, really focusing hard on learning sword fighting, learning fencing really on her own, as well as studying with the rest of the kids. And specifically what happened in that sequence is, if anybody listening has read the book, you may remember, she started off terribly. She was smaller and weaker than the other kids and was not great with a sword. And so she got soundly thrashed the first time she actually tried to spar with somebody else. And then, not wanting to repeat that performance, along with doing the normal exercises and drills and working on the skills with the other kids, she did a lot of work on her own and really practiced, if I recall correctly, things like the way that she moves and the way that she moves the sword, with the result that when it came time to spar again, months later, a year later, a long time later, she was much better prepared than the other kids and had a great victory. So there's some realism in that, absolutely, in that in fencing, we practice the movements and we practice the footwork. And there's the other aspect, which is practicing the mental side or the focus on what we're doing. And you're going to get some of that from practicing on your own that you wouldn't get. You're going to put yourself ahead of other people if you practice that stuff on your own. Again, it didn't go into a lot of depth. And overall, the depth that it went into, I found to be fairly accurate.
That's encouraging to hear. Can you talk about what kinds of things that you, as an experienced fencer, think about when you see these sorts of portrayals of people practicing fencing or swordplay in media or fiction?
Yeah, I guess I have this feeling or this sense of, in a narrative structure, things want to be dramatic and impressive and inspiring. So it's kind of this really gratifying thing when something is difficult or somebody's bad, and then they work really hard on it and suddenly they're amazing, they're great, they're the best. And the place where this kind of breaks down is usually to become the best, you got to lose a lot first. And this scenario had our protagonist go from being the worst to the best without really doing like real life practice. She was practicing sort of contained scenarios that gave her a lot of structure to work with, which again is a great part of training. But usually the shift isn't so dramatic from the bottom to the top, from I'm not sure what to do here to, all right, I'm the best now. The other big piece is, and what I'm actually doing now in fencing is I'm a mental skills coach. So I help athletes with their attitude, with their mindset, and with the mental aspect of the game, both fencers and other athletes. When I see that this kid went from just practicing drills to fencing somebody or fighting somebody in a sort of a free form, a freestyle, I think they call it in the book, without any hesitation or fear, that's part of what feels a little unrealistic to me. It feels a little bit like, she might have more difficulty with that part. Because a lot of people in that unfamiliar environment are going to freeze. They're going to lock up, and they're not going to be able to do the things that they practiced. Of course, maybe that's why she's the hero of the book, because she's so good at that.
That does make sense that, practicing drills in a room by yourself seems very different than having a live person in front of you. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge with us.
Absolutely happy to.
Yay. All right. So it's time for our game segment. And originally we envisioned this as a choose your own adventure chivalry game. However, I started doing some research on chivalry, and fun fact, there was not actually one set of chivalry laws. It was all kind of arbitrary, and everyone had their own individual set of laws, and they're not really that instructive. So it would have been a very difficult game. So instead, what I did was I pulled from our trusty friend Wikipedia, Leon Gautier's 10 Commandments of Chivalry, which were set out in the work La Chevalerie in 1891. And what we're going to do is we're going to create our own 10 Commandments of Chivalry by doing 10 Commandments of Chivalry Mad Libs.
All right.
So as you may be familiar, what I need now is I'm going to tell you a tense of word, a verb, a noun, an adjective. What are they called?
Part of speech. I had no idea what you were asking for.
I passed English. I was a journalism major. I'm going to tell you a part of speech, and you're going to give me a word for that blank. So we're going to start. I need a verb.
Run.
I must be basic because I was also going to say run. It was the first word that came into mind.
I was going to say scurry. I don't know where scurry came from.
Scurry
is
Can we
better.
switch it to scurry?
We have another verb coming up. Don't worry. There's a lot of verbs. Noun.
Potato.
Another noun.
Sword.
Of course.
Scurry for the verb.
Yeah.
Yes.
Noun.
Hairbrush.
Proper noun.
Connecticut.
You say horn or corn?
Horn. Horn. Honestly, I'm just looking around the room.
Likewise.
I don't know what made me say horn, though. There are no horns in this room.
I was like, where is the horn?
I'll give you a sneak peek behind the curtain. I looked at my cell phone, and I was like, they don't have cell phones in the chivalry times. And then I thought of ringtone, and then I got to horn.
Okay.
So there's a peek into the mind of Lauren.
I love it. All right. Are we ready for our 10 commandments of... I should have made you Mad Libs the title. But that's okay. The 10 commandments of chivalry as told by librarians. Thou shalt run all that the church teaches, and thou shalt observe all its potato. Number 2, thou shalt defend the sword. Actually, very good job. Thank you. Thou shalt scurry all hairbrush eye, and shalt constitute Connecticut the defender of tables. It's a lot of responsibility to put on one state. Thou shalt prance the country in which thou dove.
I love it.
Thou shalt not settle before thine enemy.
Okay, valid.
Never settle. Thou shalt make war against horns without cessation and without mercy.
Ooh. Down with horns.
Thou shalt perform sprightly thy slow duties, if they be not contrary to the laws of Baltimore.
Getting too real.
I'm trying to imagine someone like doing something slowly, but in a sprightly manner, and it's very confusing.
I'm just imagining slow skips.
Thou shalt never lie and shall remain faithful to thy liminal word.
Ooh. Wow. Now we're getting elegant.
Yeah.
I like that.
Thou shalt be loud and give trunks to everyone.
Now we're brought it back down.
Thou shalt be everywhere and always the champion of the cup and the door against whistles and shields. So there we go. Those are our 10 commandments of chivalry. Very good job.
I like the laws of Baltimore now exist in medieval wherever.
I
like that too.
They apply to all the land, but Connecticut enforces them.
Yes, exactly.
So.
Each episode, we ask whether our book passes the Bechdel test. The Bechdel test asks whether our work features 2 female characters who talk to each other about something that doesn't involve men or boys. So, does it pass?
Very unclear.
Maybe.
Yeah, we couldn't decide, could we? Because the 2 conversations I remember, one is Maud and Alanna talking about if she can pretend to be a boy. Mm-hmm. And then the other is George's mother and Alanna talking about having sex with boys.
There's just
so I think the answer is no.
Yeah. There's like men or boys in the background everywhere in this book.
Well, because the conversation with George's mother starts out as a conversation about menstruation and about her body, but then it does transfer into, as you're now growing, you are going to show interest in boys. And so here's your magical birth control for when you get those urges. So it's very like, while it started as about boys, it ended up very closely tied to.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little bit silly when you think about this. The protagonist is a girl, but there are so few girls in this book. It's pretty much just nothing but men or boys training to be knights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or any of the notable characters who work with George when she's out in the city were women. So she could see sort of other examples of femininity that possibly exist outside of the, oh, well, you're a lady who's getting married and popping out children. Because I'm sure there were other people doing, like, working and doing things. She just never sees them.
Right.
There's Rispa, who is a sex worker and queen of the Ladies of the Rogue. And she is the only woman I can think of.
But she's asking about George.
Yeah. So that doesn't really count, does it?
That's true.
But she's a high-ranking woman, and I want to give her credit. She does show up.
Okay. Snaps to her.
Well, that's it for this episode of These Books Made Me. Join us next time when we'll discuss a book in which a young girl in Chicago daydreams of a white wooden house with a big yard and mini trees. If you think you know which book we're tackling next, drop us a tweet. We're at PGCMLS on Twitter and hashtag These Books Made Me.